Part One, Chapter One, Sections 3 through 5 of The Possessed by Fyodor Dostoyevsky. Translated by Constance Garnett. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine. Chapter One, Section 3. There are strange friendships. The two friends are always ready to fly at one another and go on like that all their lives, and yet they cannot separate. Parting, in fact, is utterly impossible. The one who has begun the quarrel and separated will be the first to fall ill and even die, perhaps, if the separation comes off. I know for a positive fact that several times Stepan Trofimovitch has jumped up from the sofa and beaten the wall with his fists after the most intimate and emotional tête-à-tête with Varvara Petrovna. This proceeding was by no means an empty symbol. Indeed, on one occasion he broke some plaster off the wall. It may be asked how I come to know such delicate details. What if I were myself a witness of it? What if Stepan Trofimovitch himself has on more than one occasion sobbed on my shoulder while he described to me in lurid colours all his most secret feelings? And what was there he did not say at such times? But what almost always happened after these tearful outbreaks was that next day he was ready to crucify himself for his ingratitude. He would send for me in a hurry, or run over to see me, simply to assure me that Varvara Petrovna was an angel of honour and delicacy, while he was very much the opposite. He did not only run to confide in me, but on more than one occasion described it all to her in the most eloquent letter, and wrote a full signed confession that no longer ago than the day before he had told an outsider that she kept him out of vanity, that she was envious of his talents and erudition, that she hated him and was only afraid to express her hatred openly, dreading that he would leave her and so damage her literary reputation; that this drove him to self‐contempt, and he was resolved to die a violent death, and that he was waiting for the final word from her which would decide everything, and so on in the same style. You can fancy after this what an hysterical pitch the nervous outbreaks of this most innocent of all 50-year-old infants sometimes reached. I once read one of these letters after some quarrel between them, arising from a trivial matter but growing venomous as it went on. I was horrified and besought him not to send it. "I must... more honourable... duty... I shall die if I don't confess everything, everything," he answered almost in delirium, and he did send the letter. That was the difference between them, that Varvara Petrovna would never have sent such a letter. It is true that he was passionately fond of writing, he wrote to her though he lived in the same house, and during hysterical interludes he would write 2 letters a day. I know for a fact that she always read these letters with the greatest attention, even when she received 2 a day, and after reading them she put them away in a special drawer, sorted and annotated. Moreover, she pondered them in her heart. But she kept her friend all day without an answer, met him as though there were nothing the matter, exactly as though nothing special had happened the day before. By degrees she broke him in so completely that at last he did not himself dare to allude to what had happened the day before, and only glanced into her eyes at times. But she never forgot anything, while he sometimes forgot too quickly, and encouraged by her composure he would not infrequently, if friends came in, laugh and make jokes over the champagne the very same day. With what malignancy she must have looked at him at such moments, while he noticed nothing. Perhaps in a week's time, a month's time, or even 6 months later, chancing to recall some phrase in such a letter, and then the whole letter with all its attendant circumstances, he would suddenly grow hot with shame, and be so upset that he fell ill with one of his attacks of summer cholera. These attacks of a sort of summer cholera were in some cases the regular consequence of his nervous agitations, and were an interesting peculiarity of his physical constitution. No doubt Varvara Petrovna did very often hate him, but there was one thing he had not discerned up to the end, that was that he had become for her a son, her creation, even, one may say, her invention. He had become flesh of her flesh, and she kept and supported him not simply from envy of his talents and how wounded she must have been by such suppositions! An inexhaustible love for him lay concealed in her heart in the midst of continual hatred, jealousy, and contempt. She would not let a speck of dust fall upon him, coddled him up for 22 years, would not have slept for nights together if there were the faintest breath against his reputation as a poet, a learned man, and a public character. She had invented him, and had been the first to believe in her own invention. He was, after a fashion, her day dream. But in return she exacted a great deal from him, sometimes even slavishness. It was incredible how long she harboured resentment. I have two anecdotes to tell about that. Section 4. On one occasion, just at the time when the first rumours of the emancipation of the serfs were in the air, when all Russia was exulting and making ready for a complete regeneration, Varvara Petrovna was visited by a baron from Petersburg, a man of the highest connections, and very closely associated with the new reform. Varvara Petrovna prized such visits highly, as her connections in higher circles had grown weaker and weaker since the death of her husband, and had at last ceased altogether. The baron spent an hour drinking tea with her. There was no one else present but Stepan Trofimovitch, whom Varvara Petrovna invited and exhibited. The baron had heard something about him before, or affected to have done so, but paid little attention to him at tea. Stepan Trofimovitch, of course, was incapable of making a social blunder, and his manners were most elegant. Though I believe he was by no means of exalted origin, yet it happened that he had from earliest childhood been brought up in a Moscow household of high rank, and consequently was well bred. He spoke French like a Parisian. Thus the baron was to have seen from the first glance the sort of people with whom Varvara Petrovna surrounded herself, even in provincial seclusion. But things did not fall out like this. When the baron positively asserted the absolute truth of the rumours of the great reform, which were then only just beginning to be heard, Stepan Trofimovitch could not contain himself and suddenly shouted "Hurrah!" and even made some gesticulation indicative of delight. His ejaculation was not over loud and quite polite, his delight was even perhaps premeditated, and his gesture purposely studied before the looking glass half an hour before tea. But something must have been amiss with it, for the baron permitted himself a faint smile, though he at once, with extraordinary courtesy, put in a phrase concerning the universal and befitting emotion of all Russian hearts in view of the great event. Shortly afterwards he took his leave, and at parting did not forget to hold out two fingers to Stepan Trofimovitch. On returning to the drawing room Varvara Petrovna was at first silent for 2 or 3 minutes, and seemed to be looking for something on the table. Then she turned to Stepan Trofimovitch, and with pale face and flashing eyes she hissed in a whisper, "I shall never forgive you for that." Next day she met her friend as though nothing had happened. She never referred to the incident, but 13 years afterwards, at a tragic moment, she recalled it and reproached him with it, and she turned pale just as she had done 13 years before. Only twice in the course of her life did she say to him, "I shall never forgive you for that." The incident with the baron was the second time. But the first incident was so characteristic, and had so much influence on the fate of Stepan Trofimovitch, that I venture to refer to that too. It was in 1855, in springtime, in May, just after the news had reached Skvoreshniki of the death of Lieutenant General Stavrogin, a frivolous old gentleman who died of a stomach ailment on the way to the Crimea, where he was hastening to join the army on active service. Varvara Petrovna was left a widow and put on deep mourning. She could not, it is true, deplore his death very deeply, since for the last 4 years she had been completely separated from him owing to incompatibility of temper, and was giving him an allowance. The lieutenant general himself had nothing but 150 serfs and his pay, besides his position and his connections. All the money and Skvoreshniki belonged to Varvara Petrovna, the only daughter of a very rich contractor. Yet she was shocked by the suddenness of the news, and retired into complete solitude. Stepan Trofimovitch, of course, was always at her side. May was in its full beauty. The evenings were exquisite. The wild cherry was in flower. The two friends walked every evening in the garden, and used to sit till nightfall in the arbour, and pour out their thoughts and feelings to one another. They had poetic moments. Under the influence of the change in her position, Varvara Petrovna talked more than usual. She, as it were, clung to the heart of her friend, and this continued for several evenings. A strange idea suddenly came over Stepan Trofimovitch. Was not the inconsolable widow reckoning upon him, and expecting from him when her mourning was over the offer of his hand? A cynical idea, but the very loftiness of a man's nature sometimes increases a disposition to cynical ideas, if only from the many-sidedness of his culture. He began to look more deeply into it, and thought it seemed like it. He pondered. "Her fortune is immense, of course, but..." Varvara Petrovna certainly could not be called a beauty. She was a tall, yellow, bony woman with an extremely long face, suggestive of a horse. Stepan Trofimovitch hesitated more and more; he was tortured by doubts, he positively shed tears of indecision once or twice, he wept not infrequently. In the evenings, that is to say in the arbour, his countenance involuntarily began to express something capricious and ironical, something coquettish and at the same time condescending. This is apt to happen, as it were, by accident, and the more gentlemanly the man the more noticeable it is. Goodness only knows what one is to think about it, but it's most likely that nothing had begun working in her heart that could have fully justified Stepan Trofimovitch's suspicions. Moreover, she would not have changed her name Stavrogin for his name, famous as it was. Perhaps there was nothing in it but the play of femininity on her side, the manifestation of an unconscious feminine yearning so natural in some extremely feminine types. However, I won't answer for it. The depths of the female heart have not been explored to this day. But I must continue. It is to be supposed that she soon inwardly guessed the significance of her friend's strange expression; she was quick and observant, and he was sometimes extremely guileless. But the evenings went on as before, and their conversations were just as poetic and interesting. And behold, on one occasion at nightfall, after the most lively and poetical conversation, they parted affectionately, warmly pressing each other's hands at the steps of the lodge where Stepan Trofimovitch slept. Every summer he used to move into this little lodge, which stood adjoining the huge seignorial house of Skvoreshniki, almost in the garden. He had only just gone in, and in restless hesitation taken a cigar, and not having yet lighted it was standing weary and motionless before the open window, gazing at the light feathery white clouds gliding around the bright moon, when suddenly a faint rustle made him start and turn round. Varvara Petrovna, whom he had left only 4 minutes earlier, was standing before him again. Her yellow face was almost blue, her lips were pressed tightly together and twitching at the corners. For 10 full seconds she looked him in the eyes, in silence, with a firm, relentless gaze, and suddenly whispered rapidly, "I shall never forgive you for this." When 10 years later Stepan Trofimovitch, after closing the doors, told me this melancholy tale in a whisper, he vowed that he had been so petrified on the spot that he had not seen or heard how Varvara Petrovna had disappeared. As she never once afterwards alluded to the incident, and everything went on as though nothing had happened, he was all his life inclined to the idea that it was all an hallucination, a symptom of illness; the more so as he was actually taken ill that very night, and was indisposed for a fortnight, which, by the way, cut short the interviews in the arbour. But in spite of his vague theory of hallucination, he seemed every day, all his life, to be expecting the continuation and, so to say, the dénouement of this affair. He could not believe that that was the end of it, and if so he must have looked strangely sometimes at his friend. Section 5. She had herself designed the costume for him which he wore for the rest of his life. It was elegant and characteristic. A long black frock coat, buttoned almost to the top, but stylishly cut; a soft hat, in summer a straw hat, with a wide brim; a white batiste cravat with a full bow and hanging ends, a cane with a silver knob; his hair flowed on to his shoulders. It was dark brown, and only lately had begun to get a little grey. He was clean shaven. He was said to have been very handsome in his youth, and to my mind he was still an exceptionally impressive figure even in old age. Besides, who can talk of old age at 53? From his special pose as a patriot, however, he did not try to appear younger, but seemed rather to pride himself on the solidity of his age, and, dressed as described, tall and thin with flowing hair, he looked almost like a patriarch, or even more like the portrait of the poet Kukolnik, engraved in the edition of his works published in 1830 or thereabouts. This resemblance was especially striking when he sat in the garden in summer time, on a seat under a bush of flowering lilac, with both hands propped on his cane and an open book beside him, musing poetically over the setting sun. In regard to books I may remark that he came in later years rather to avoid reading. But that was only quite towards the end. The papers and magazines ordered in great profusion by Varvara Petrovna he was continually reading. He never lost interest in the successes of Russian literature either, though he always maintained a dignified attitude with regard to them. He was at one time engrossed in the study of our home and foreign politics, but he soon gave up the undertaking with a gesture of despair. It sometimes happened that he would take de Tocqueville with him into the garden while he had a Paul de Kock in his pocket. But these are trivial matters. I must observe in parenthesis about the portrait of Kukolnik. The engraving had first come into the hands of Varvara Petrovna when she was a girl in a high class boarding school in Moscow. She fell in love with the portrait at once, after the habit of all girls at school, who fall in love with anything they come across, as well as with their teachers, especially the drawing and writing masters. What is interesting in this, though, is not the characteristics of girls, but the fact that even at 50 Varvara Petrovna kept the engraving among her most intimate and treasured possessions, so that perhaps it was only on this account that she had designed for Stepan Trofimovitch a costume somewhat like the poet's in the engraving. But that, of course, is a trifling matter too. For the first years, or more accurately, for the first half of the time he spent with Varvara Petrovna, Stepan Trofimovitch was still planning a book, and every day seriously prepared to write it. But during the later period he must have forgotten even what he had done. More and more frequently he used to say to us, "I seem to be ready for work, my materials are collected, yet the work doesn't get done. Nothing is done." And he would bow his head dejectedly. No doubt this was calculated to increase his prestige in our eyes as a martyr to science, but he himself was longing for something else. "They have forgotten me, I'm no use to any one," broke from him more than once. This intensified depression took special hold of him towards the end of the fifties. Varvara Petrovna realized at last that it was a serious matter. Besides, she could not endure the idea that her friend was forgotten and useless. To distract him, and at the same time to renew his fame, she carried him off to Moscow, where she had fashionable acquaintances in the literary and scientific world. But it appeared that Moscow too was unsatisfactory. It was a peculiar time. Something new was beginning, quite unlike the stagnation of the past, something very strange too, though it was felt everywhere, even at Skvoreshniki. Rumours of all sorts reached us. The facts were generally more or less well known, but it was evident that in addition to the facts there were certain ideas accompanying them, and what's more, a great number of them, and this was perplexing. It was impossible to estimate and find out exactly what was the drift of these ideas. Varvara Petrovna was prompted by the feminine composition of her character to a compelling desire to penetrate the secret of them. She took to reading newspapers and magazines, prohibited publications printed abroad, and even the revolutionary manifestoes which were just beginning to appear at the time, she was able to procure them all. But this only set her head in a whirl. She fell to writing letters; she got few answers, and they grew more incomprehensible as time went on. Stepan Trofimovitch was solemnly called upon to explain those ideas to her once for all, but she remained distinctly dissatisfied with his explanations. Stepan Trofimovitch's view of the general movement was supercilious in the extreme. In his eyes all it amounted to was that he was forgotten and of no use. At last his name was mentioned, at first in periodicals published abroad as that of an exiled martyr, and immediately afterwards in Petersburg as that of a former star in a celebrated constellation. He was even for some reason compared with Radishtchev. Then someone printed the statement that he was dead, and promised an obituary notice of him. Stepan Trofimovitch instantly perked up and assumed an air of immense dignity. All his disdain for his contemporaries evaporated, and he began to cherish the dream of joining the movement and showing his powers. Varvara Petrovna's faith in everything instantly revived, and she was thrown into a violent ferment. It was decided to go to Petersburg without a moment's delay, to find out everything on the spot, to go into everything personally, and, if possible, to throw themselves heart and soul into the new movement. Among other things she announced that she was prepared to found a magazine of her own, and henceforward to devote her whole life to it. Seeing what it had come to, Stepan Trofimovitch became more condescending than ever, and on the journey began to behave almost patronizingly to Varvara Petrovna, which she at once laid up in her heart against him. She had, however, another very important reason for the trip, which was to renew her connections in higher spheres. It was necessary, as far as she could, to remind the world of her existence, or at any rate to make an attempt to do so. The ostensible object of the journey was to see her only son, who was just finishing his studies at a Petersburg lyceum. End of Part One, Chapter 1, Section 5. Recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine.